Good people, welcome back. We can now talk about. We are now going to talk about class constructors. Let's talk about constructors. Constructors. So, what we've been doing so far, what we've been doing is we've been having different. We have been having the init constructor. For example, in this, for example, here we're having the attributes being defined in each instance, right? Like when you want to pass the speed, we pass the speed in each instance, right? Now, using a constructor, we can have we can make the init method be a constructor by customizing it and adding additional parameters. So what we're saying is the init method constructor, we add more parameters. So we know at the beginning we just have the self, but right now we're going to have more parameters, the ones we're going to use in our instance, so that when we do the instantiation, we don't pass the attributes still. That's like here. We won't pass the speed here anymore. We won't be doing the redefinition of them anymore, since we'll be passing them in the init constructor. Let's do an example. I want us to do an example of a rectangle. Let's do rectangle rectangle.py. So these are constructor. Let's do a constructor here. So we'll do class constructor, class constructor. Yeah, so we're going to have class rectangle. Rectangle. Now, initially we'd have the init method just having the self parameter, right? This is how it was initially. The examples we've done initially, it was like this, but right now we're going to pass more parameters which we'll use in our program. So for example, it's we want to do the for example, we might have a length and width, right? Width, yeah. So we have the self, length, and width. So our parameters here which we would want to work with is length, which will be equal to length, and then our self dot width is equals to width. Now, so our init constructor right now have more parameters, and we have the parameters here defined to have the length and the width. Now, so in our instance, when we're doing the instantiation of the class, when we do rectangle one, let's say rectangle one. Okay, rectangle. Do rectangle one. Rectangle one is equals to, so we say rectangle, since we are doing an instance. So initially we were just having the opening and closing bracket. If you check our previous examples, we just had the open and closing bracket. Right now, because we have the constructor and we have the parameters passed in our init method, we're going to pass the length and the width. Length and the width is 6. So if we do a print right now, right? If we do a print, and it's a rectangle one, the instance of the class dot width, right? Let's see what happens when we run that. So we'll say Python rectangle.py. We have 6, right? So this is length. It follows the order. We have length being 11 and width being 6. That's how we find 6 here. Same thing we can do for length. Length. So when we run that as well, we'll have 6 and 11. That's what we find here. So this is a cleaner way of having our parameters passed. For example, in our class 7 example of a marathon runner, we had these are class attribute. Okay, we were dealing here with class attributes and the likes. Let me use example 5 for it to be easy. So right here, the difference between having it this way and having it in a constructor way is when you see here we have the attributes, but you don't have it defined in the init method. So had we had them defined in the init method, we'd access them without having to redefine them here. Then instead of redefining them here, we'd pass them in this opening and closing bracket. Let's do an example using this. We do an example of employee 1 and then we do the same thing, right? Let's do employee 1.py. Then we do the same thing we did in class 5. This was it. I'll copy this, then paste in employee 1. So let's change here. So what do we want to pass here? We want to pass the wage, and we want to pass the hours worked. Hours _ worked. Right? So right now we have passed the parameters in our init method. Now, so we'll say here self.wage is equals to wage, and then we'll say self.hours equals to hours worked. Right? I hope that's clear. I'm just doing the same thing we did in our example. I hope that's clear using our employee 1. So everything remains the same, except when we're doing a redefinition of the same. Let me comment this out. So when you're doing this, we'll now pass the wage, which will be 6.25, and then we pass the hours worked as 45. So when you do that, then we comment this out, then we run this as employee 1. Let's say Python, employee 1. We see Alice net pay is 281.25, basically a multiplication of this and this. So this is the way constructors are used in Python to ensure the code is cleaner, and basically we are containing, or we having the attributes well contained and maintained. These are cleaner code as compared to what we had initially, and it works the same as what we have in class 5. So we run class 5 with C281. Class 5. We have 21.25 the same way we had 21.25 in our defined employee example. So our code right here, let's go back to our rectangle, since this is what we're using as an example. So our rectangle class, the constructor being this one, has 3 parameters. It has the self, so it has 3 parameters. It has the parameters, the self, it has the length and the width. Yeah, self, length, and the width. I hope we've seen that we now have 3 parameters. So when we now want to once we have the parameters here, right? These are the parameters. We have self, length, and width. When we have the parameters, so when we want to have a new instance, that's what we did here, an instance of the rectangle. We must pass the arguments to the instance. They are the arguments. So right, these are so we pass arguments here. So you can say here pass arguments to the constructor. So what we're doing here is we're passing these arguments here to the length and width. I hope that makes sense of the constructor and how constructor works. This is an example of constructor. You can work on changing the examples we had initially to be in a constructor way. So another example. Okay, let's since we've seen that example, let's use another example. So another example of constructor parameters. So constructor parameters can have default values. Yeah. So for example, it can have the name is equals to value syntax. I hope that makes sense. That constructors as well can have the name value syntax, right? So an example we'll do, let's do employee. Okay, can we do employee 2? Let me see. We can as well have it here. Can have the length being 5, right? So we have length is 5. So that will be the name value syntax. So when we have then we have width is equals to 6, right? So which means when we are calling the when we're calling the instance, we it's not really a must we pass the rectangle. So when we have default values, right? When we have a constructor can have the default values as a length and width. We can have 5 and 6, right? Which means when we're calling the instance, when we're instantiating the class, it's not a must we pass the arguments to the class. So for example, when you call the width will be given 6 and the length will be given 5 because we have the default values. How does that make sense? We have had an example. We have done an example of constructors in Python. I hope that makes sense. In case of any question, let me know. That's it for today. We'll get back here with more examples as we go along. But I hope the constructor keyword and how it works and everything now makes sense to you. Thanks for your time and have a good one.